Well, I'm going to call the rest of the speakers up, and what we're going to do is we're going to use the rest of our time to have questions. And if you'd like to ask a question, I would ask that you come up to the microphone, and please state your name and affiliation. Is there a question, or because I'm happy to ask questions for the whole time if nobody else wants to ask questions.
I'm Scott Williams with the Wisconsin Energy Institute here. My question is for Professor Hill. I was wondering, what was the major driver of the particulate emissions for the corn ethanol and the corn stover? Was it coal electricity? Was it the fertilizer? Or were you able to tease that out?
Yeah, so it really is a lot of factors. It's the biorefineries themselves. It's the fertilizer use. It's the transportation of biomass to the biorefinery. It's combustion. There's no one single factor. It's that there's a lot of, I guess you could call them inefficiencies in the sense in the process compared to petroleum fuels.
I'm Barbie Russo in the Minnesota House. This question is for Mr. Herner. You were talking about hydrogen and electric vehicles, and how do you account for how that hydrogen is produced when you're looking at it as an alternative fuel?
Well, there's a process for that of developing the life cycle analysis, and we actually use the GREET model as well. And so there would be a different CI or carbon intensity assigned to hydrogen made from natural gas versus through some kind of renewable way. So you just do the life cycle analysis and determine what the carbon intensity of that particular amount of hydrogen is.
I'm Max Fisher. I'm a chemical engineering student at UW, and I have a question for Dr. Cortright. I was wondering, so you mentioned that you've been using your technology to work in the plastics industry. I know a company partnered with Cargill has also done, used sustainable biofuels to reformulate other industrial products like transformer oils. I was wondering, do you see other industrial industries moving towards using sustainable carbon neutral bioproducts, and maybe could that growing infrastructure support the economic basis for a future biofuel infrastructure?
The answer is yes. It's a case that we're seeing more and more of the brand owners and larger companies. They have their own sustainability programs. Some has to do on power generation, but other has to be where they obtain their raw materials. And they're becoming very sophisticated on doing life cycle analysis and understanding that, and that if they can get their raw materials from a different source than, say, petroleum, then they'll move that direction. In some cases, the early movers, they're willing to pay a premium. In other cases, they want to wait until it's at parity to whatever they're trying to replace.
Okay, I'm going to take the opportunity to ask a question since no one's standing in line. I think it's, I think all of you brought up this a little bit, but I guess I wanted to kind of ask everyone this question a little bit, is that, it's interesting, obviously there's a tremendous amount of market drivers, and it was talked about some, but there's also this sort of issue of sort of the local perspective, and the local perspective, which I guess Jorn mentioned, the California, but to me, the issue about sort of local economy and what that means, and I think Paul brought that up some, and I guess clearly there's huge economic drivers and a local scale about using renewable, and Randy mentioned the comment about $100 million. Well, compared to a petroleum refinery, that's actually relatively small in some sense in terms of those costs. And so I'm kind of wondering if what all of your perspectives are, sort of instead of on the broad brush, but say, as a state like California is very large and is doing their own thing, and what does that mean for other regions, the Northeast, the Midwest, and even internationally, and what that means for biofuels? It seems to me there's huge opportunities if the sort of the boundaries of the problem were drawn more on a regional scale. I don't know if anybody wants to try to answer that first, or not answered at all?
Well, I guess I sit closest, so I'll take the first stab at it. We have a stated desire to have a lot of the production and the feedstocks come from California itself. But it's not actually, you don't see that in the actual regulations themselves that we have promulgated, just because we're trying to develop a market for low carbon fuels wherever they may be developed. And you know, there's always the question of the sugarcane ethanol from Brazil and whatnot. It has a really low carbon intensity, especially compared to Midwestern corn. So there is an interest in helping the local economy, but our regulations don't actually bring that to bear right now. We're just focused on the carbon intensity of the fuel and trying to develop that industry broadly, whether it's in California or elsewhere.
I mean, just to follow up on that real quick, is you think that's driven by more of a political driver, or the fact that California is obviously trying to be a leader nationally and internationally? So obviously, if you did things in a more local perspective, that would have a huge impact on the outcome.
Yeah, and I'm not familiar. I agree with that, and you run into certain issues if you try to mandate that everything be done locally. There's a commerce clause in our Constitution, I believe, and there's other issues of CEQA, and if you put biorefineries in California, what are the local impacts of pollution and things like that. So there's a lot of other legal considerations that you have to make. And so at least for the California Air Resources Board point of view, we've just stayed focused on the technical goal that we have before us.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. In Northeast states, it's local development, but it's kind of writ large. It's what the elected leaders, that's the main focus. So everything is colored with that gloss. We're doing some state climate planning exercises with a couple of our states, and they're made up of various agency heads, and every one of them has their economic development official on these groups, but they're not the only ones. So that's always there. But at the same time, same in California, is there are legal constraints. Now, you can't control what a state legislator may say, but you cannot adopt a law to promote something in your state that prohibits something else from outside the state. So there are limits to that kind of local development rhetoric. But at the same time, in the Northeast, we don't have oil. We don't even have natural gas. It's being piped in. So it's almost like biofuels, to the extent they can work in those local resources, is free money. And that's what the economic development people think about it. There are those downsides I went through, but that's the situation we are in the Northeast. Other states that may have their own resources or different resources might look at it differently.
So there's no doubt that some of our interventions, like the mandate of corn ethanol, have been very good for certain local economies, but we always have to ask, well, who is that at the expense of? And in this case, it's largely the expense of taxpayers and consumers across the U.S. who are paying higher prices for food and other products. So I guess I take a slightly different tack in terms of local, and whether we should necessarily value our neighbor who lives next to us more than our global neighbor who lives halfway around the world. Both, development in a global sense is as lofty a goal as local development.
It is the thing to remember for a biorefinery, because of the economics, you really need to build it where the biomass is at. So by definition, it's going to be rural development for that. So, and you're seeing some of that, and it kind of goes with the wood industry. It's all going to South America for pulping and that sort of stuff. So you're seeing northern Wisconsin is hurting. You're seeing in the south that's hurting. And as we were developing projects, we had discussions, and people in Alabama, Mississippi, North Carolina that have forest industry, they have incentives for people to build biorefineries there because they're losing jobs at this time. And I think it's the same thing in northern Wisconsin. So there is, I think, a local impact that could be had from biofuels.
I have a related question. Wonder if you could polish up your crystal ball a little bit. So some of the driver for corn ethanol is the fuel standards or the requirement that ethanol be mixed into fuel. Do you see any movement or possibility of movement that law would be changed? I gather it's a federal law. I know you're mostly technical and this is a bit more political. Any movement or chance of movement there?
Just real quick, could you state your name and where you're
Jeff
from?
Erickson, Navigant Consultant.
Well, I guess the big sort of answer is I don't see any law ever coming out of this Congress anytime on anything. But particularly on ethanol, that has had, for good or bad reasons, that's had a shelf life for a long, long time. If you're asking for a personal prediction, no, I don't see this changing by law.
Anybody else want to? Okay.
My name's Ryan Walker, and I'm with the Engine Research Center. And one of the things that the stationary engine industry has has been moving towards dual fuel applications in order to both reduce NOx and PM, PM being one of the focuses of the discussions today. Ethanol is very amenable to dual fuel combustion, but with respect to woody biomass and also CARB as well, our recent efforts by CARB, dimethyl ether is proving to be a contender competing for space in the renewable fuel standard. I was wondering if each of you could touch on whether DME is appearing to be contradictory or complementary to current renewable fuel efforts.
I can say it's never come up in any of my discussions, so I have no insight on the use of dimethyl ether.
There are technologies that can generate DME. It's primarily going to gasification, such as municipal waste. I know of a couple of companies that are doing that, mostly in Canada as well as Scandinavia. They make syngas, and then they go to methanol, and then it goes to DME. And I know Scandinavia, they're looking at DME as a diesel replacement.
Well, under the low carbon fuel standard, it could be introduced if it has a low carbon index, of course. And I kind of have heard about people talking about DME in the hallways, but it's still not a major factor, but it could be.
Hi, my name is Mary Blanchard. I'm with the Wisconsin Energy Institute. My question was really for Mr. Herner. In terms of the California Air Resources Board's view of electric vehicles, I was really surprised to see how significant the emissions were for EV vehicles from Mr. Hill's presentation, for the grid average, not just for coal-fired or coal-generated electricity. So I'm just interested in how you treat, first of all, the production of the battery or the enabling technology, and then how you look at the grid overall in terms of the source of the electricity.
Certainly. Well, you have to couple that with our renewable portfolio standard and the fact that the California grid is becoming very, very clean. We don't have any coal-fired power plants. We don't have barely any coal in California. Actually, I remember going to the Railroad Museum in Sacramento not too long ago, and one of the early problems the cross-country trains had was that once they get out here, there was no coal to get back. We don't have much coal. We don't burn any coal. We either have natural gas or renewables are the main sources of our electricity. So our electric grid is quite clean. So we don't have all that CO2 associated with burning coal to generate the CO2. Now there's been studies. So the carbon index that I showed for electricity well, I think it was one of my backup slides. I did have a backup slide with the carbon intensity of electricity in California. That is just for California. In the earlier session, we did see how the country has different grids in different places, and if you use the WEC, I forget what it is, Western Electric something, then our electrically powered vehicles don't look as good as if you use just a California electric grid. But we have chosen to take credit for the electric grid that we are putting in place in terms of calculating the CO2 associated with motor vehicles. I should also say that you do get NOx reductions when you do this. You create less NOx certainly in cities, and it's interesting actually the ozone standards that we have to meet mean that you need to get NOx reductions are a more forceful driver of us needing to go to zero emissions than greenhouse gases right now. Those targets are coming up quicker, and there's more pressure on getting NOx reductions just to meet air quality standards rather than producing combustion to meet greenhouse gases at this point. So we need a lot of electric vehicles out there for both reasons.
I'm sorry, let me just ask a quick follow-up. So in the low carbon fuel standard, do you account for the production of the battery as an enabling technology in that program? I mean, when you're looking at the
Yes. And you had a slide too where you still see significant reductions from light duty or vehicles if you just, I forget what the other, there was a couple of components to that bar where you had just wind and solar, and so you still get a dramatic reduction, but you have to have very clean energy, even with the batteries, when you account for the batteries.
Step out a few minutes for phone call. So, Jamie, if you already asked this question, this is a Jamie Shower question that I asked for all of you. It's about particulates. General question, is there any difference between regular diesel and diesel generated by biofuels? So is there any difference as far as what we're seeing for health reasons? But then I have a specific question for Jason. In your analysis where you compared all these different sources for different transportation, different fuels, one issue is PM and where is the PM? And so my question is there any difference in the type of PM? The speciation, the stuff that Jamie studies, the coal dust versus the transportation emissions versus what's burned from corn stover. Did you get at any of the differences in the toxic nature of the particles? So the first general question and then
Sure, I'll take them actually in reverse order. Like any good research, our study that I published raised many more questions than it answered. So we're now doing all sorts of sensitivity analyses on that, looking at the source and partitioning and so forth of those particular species to understand better their true effects. We're also looking at different fuels. We're looking at the California grid mix, for instance. We're looking at second generation biofuel production beyond corn stover, switchgrass, and so forth. So stay tuned. We'll be able to give you much more detail in terms of the partitioning of those primary and secondary particulate matter effects. Part of what we're doing is developing some reduced form models to help us look at those. As you can imagine, the runs through this were might be WRF Chem runs, very detailed air quality modeling. And so if we're going to explore some of these sensitivities, we had to find ways to speed that up. So I could say really to both of your questions, stay tuned because we're doing much more detailed modeling.
I guess from a regulatory standpoint, there's no difference in the diesel PM that comes out from an engine that burns fossil diesel versus biodiesel. It's still a diesel particle. It's still a soot core with a bunch of nasty organics attached to it. And diesel particulate matter, irrespective of the type of fuel, is identified as a toxic air contaminant in California. And so we have very aggressive programs to reduce it irrespective of whether or not, again, it's from a fossil or a bio fuel. And the good thing about that is that there is technology that really takes care of this in the form of a diesel particulate filter. Filter doesn't matter what type of fuel you burn, it'll catch the particulate and reduce it by 99%. And I'm sure that some of the organics are different in their speciation, but I think Jamie can probably speak to that better than I can. So.
Yeah, it's one of the things we looked at as well. Our particular fuel, what we're generating, is a drop-in, so it's very similar to a standard petroleum type diesel, but particularly since the Volkswagen thing came about, we started looking, okay, what studies have been done to understand you can reduce the particulates, and there are particular type of molecules such as normal paraffins and that sort of stuff that will have lower production of particulates. It won't eliminate it completely. And so there are potential pathways of going from biofuels to generate that could be different than what you see in a petroleum refinery.
I guess just to put things in perspective, I'll add that, I don't know, biodiesel has been shown to reduce PM emissions from diesel by 10, 15%. A diesel particulate filter will reduce it by 95 or more percent. So the biofuels is not a solution to the problem with diesel PM. Diesel particulate filters are.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think that's a great way to end. I do think that there's a lot of things that still have to be discussed at lunch, as well as worked out in the next couple of years. So I'd like to once again thank our speakers, and everyone should know after this we'll move on to lunch in the room where the main talks were this morning. So thank you again.